Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good to see you here. Thank you for joining me during nap time. But I hope you had a good night last night. And this is a great way to start off a new year. We're on this beautiful ship with new friends going to new places. And so life is good. And today I'm going to talk about our port of call after tomorrow, Réunion in Mauritius, which is, I call a disputed island because many have claimed it, many have fought over it, and there's still disputes to this day, which I'll talk about. Has anybody been there before? It's so correct me when I need that. But of course, this is one of the major island groups in the central Indian Ocean. This is actually the Port St. Louis, the waterfront where we'll be going. But of course, the island group is here, Port Louis, named after Louis XV, the King of France, back when it was a French colony. And of course, we've come from the Seychelles down. Tomorrow will be at Réunion, Port Louis, and then on our way back. So we're getting quite a few nice sea days, and a view of this beautiful, clean, open ocean. Has anybody seen another ship? No? Well, all those big tankers that are diverted from the Suez, I believe, hug the coast and they go down through the Madagascar Strait. So they're not out here in the Central Ocean, unless they happen to be going to Australia. But anyway, here we are, this group of islands. The Mascarenhas, named by the Portuguese to discover. Mauritius is here. This is the area of dispute now, the British Indian Ocean territory of the Chagos Archipelago, which is in the news these days because, again, it's a territorial issue in this part of the world. But the country of Mauritius is mainly the island of what used to be called Île-de-France. Now it's just the Isle of Saint-Maurice or Mauritius. And then they have these other outlying islands, Rodriguez, San Brendan, Agalega, and then the great coral archipelago about 800 sea miles northeast of the main island. This is a curious one, Tromelin, which was claimed by the French, supposedly given to the British, and then it is supposed to be part of Mauritius, but it was never in the treaty. So it's the island that is only a couple of people live there, but again, they're in dispute as to who is their master. And it's, again, one of these unresolved issues in this area. But this is the main place, Île Maurice, Mauritius. You see that all the names are actually French because the island was French for so long that the de facto naming and much of the population comes from that area. But we are docking up here at Port Louis. Then, like Réunion, it has a mountainous interior with much more plains then. And then a wilder south land down here. And some of us are going over to the old Grand Port where the battle was. But it's a pretty big island and, of course, worthy of staying longer, but we have just our couple of days there. But compared to Réunion, it is volcanic similarly, but it's much more eroded and is not quite as dramatically rift with great canyons or active volcanoes, and most of it is agriculture. Its major economy was the sugar trade, the sugar plantations which were set up, and that was the great white gold of previous eras when it was so precious. And so it was actually a plant that was grown traditionally in India that was then brought to the Canary Islands and then brought to the Americas and brought to all these other islands that were made up of the colonial trade that Lloyd was talking about earlier. But there's still a few areas that are designated parks, and they're the remnant of the original heavily forested island. Only about 2% of the island has any forest cover at all, and it's mostly scrub brush and not really more than what you see here. This is the Black River Gorge, which goes down toward the main port of Port Louis. But when the first people came here, this was an uninhabited island until some Arabic traders came, some Maldivian sailors, fisher people came over, but nobody had a town or a settlement until after the Portuguese found it, and then the Dutch started to settle it, and then came the French and then the British, and now the rest of the world. But this is one of those fantastical paintings of the French painter Savary, who did Garden of Eden, and I believe that's Adam and Eve over there, wondering when they're going to be able to afford clothes. And all of these maybe fantastic creatures were put together, if only in a painting. And so here's another one with deer. Deer were introduced here, like feral pigs and dogs and cats and rats, all that sort of stuff. But again, he has macaw, that's actually from South America, herons, which are not native here, other fantastic creatures, but above all I believe it's over there, the first of the depictions of the dodo bird. So this is a vision of the world back when it was rather fantastically new to most, particularly Europeans. There is I couldn't find the picture. There's a lovely parody of Adam and Eve in one of these pictures saying, "You didn't answer my text," but you can look that up. And for all of the imaginations, there actually are remarkable flora and fauna here. This is called the sea poison tree, which is endemic all the way to Indonesia, and it's planted in tropical gardens around the world. But it looks fairly innocuous, except it has nuts and leaves and flowers that are all poisonous. And so nothing will eat it, and traditionally in many parts of the tropics it would be used to mash it up and use it for fishing, because some of the poison in the leaves would stun fish in the lagoon, and therefore they could be caught. But if you eat any of that, you'll get violently ill, even though the flower looks lovely, like a mimosa or something. And this is the curious nut, which when it is shed by the tree, if it gets in the water, it can float for a decade or more before it finally washes up somewhere and will sprout, like a coconut, except that's why it's spread all through the tropics so far and wide, because it's so enduring. And here's another one called the bird eater bush. It has a Latin Linnaean name, but that's what the local name often is, because again, it doesn't look like much, except that the flower emits a sticky paste that sticks to the leaves and then drops on the ground, kind of like a sap that covers the bottom of the plant. And a bird, if it lands on the leaf or it's on the ground, it'll actually get fouled up and get stuck, and thereby slowly starve to death, and then nourish the roots of the plant. So it's sort of like a Venus flycatcher, but a very passive, pleasant-looking plant. And then there's the various endemic bird life, not necessarily only in Mauritius, but across this part of the Indian Ocean. The red-footed booby, which looks like he has his dancing shoes on or something. And then this incredible blue and yellow bit, and at different stages of maturity, it changes color, so you can tell the age of the bird by the color of the beak. And I believe that there were some up on the ship the other day, as we were out of the port of Seychelles, and they were up roosting up on the mast of the ship, as if they thought they were going to get a free ride. Well, they're a beautiful bird flying around. They're way out at sea also. This is it's called the Nicobar pigeon, which is endemic to the Nicobar Islands off of India and also down here in Mauritius. It has this beautiful plumage. Unfortunately, it was caught for its feathers, which was a great trade in previous generations that decimated many tropical birds. There's another pigeon. It's endemic to the Mauritian island, which is also almost extinct because of the invasive species that would eat the eggs and chase it around. And then there's another one called the red-tailed tern. You can see that long appendage that it has for some reason. And there are more. Here's a curious bat that lives up in the mountain caves called the flying Mauritian bat. And it looks like an invention of some horror movie, or is that the new Boeing design? I'm not sure. But it has a furry face, which is unusual for a bat, but incredible wingspan and talons and all such. Well, I don't think we're going to see any of them, nor will we see the others that are extinct. For instance, the red rail or the guinea hen, which went extinct because it was a ground feeder like all the other wild versions of what we now know as the chicken. And so this was a matter of commerce. When the Europeans first went to Mughal India, they found dodo birds in the garden of the Mughal emperor that had been brought from Mauritius as a curiosity, along with all these other exotic birds, some of which are no longer with us. This and the speckled something or other, nobody knows what it is, unless some birder here might recognize it. But most famously, particularly when the Dutch arrived and they scoured the land looking for things, they drew some of the odd birds, the famous one being the dodo. And now this is one of many a depiction of a dodo bird, and they all look a little different, as if no two were quite alike. And so this was the cumbersome, maybe a meter high, ground-feeding, flightless bird, famous in Mauritius, and there are a few other outlying islands that had versions of them and different variants of the species, but they were quickly rounded up for food, and sailors would come to pick up dodo birds and turtles to feed the sailors on the long ocean voyages. And by 1660, the dodo was extinct. They found a few other samples up in the mountains that probably were hiding or else were captured by runaway slaves, but it's been extinct so long that there are no well-preserved examples of it, only some bones and skeletons. But there were many drawings. It seemed like everybody had one that would pose for them. And of course they became a cartoon favorite and a sort of a children's imaginary pet, I guess I'd call it. So, but here's a drawing that was done. Again, it features this big bony beak, and their way of living was to dig in the ground, eat roots and nuts, and that big beak could crush anything. And even the sailors chasing around, if they didn't be careful, the dodo would come up and bite their hand off. So that even though they were slow and cumbersome and easy to catch, they were still quite dangerous. So we have all these pictures that were done over time, these massive kind of clawed feet and big lumpy body. And again, every picture shows a different color or a different kind of shape of it. But there are enough skeletons in museums to say, well, this is one species and it may have had different variations in coloring depending where it was or what it was eating. They think that in evolution, these birds once flew and they rounded out island hopping, and maybe from India through the Maldives or even from other island groups. They ended up on the islands here where there were no predators. And so then they had it easy. They didn't have to fly around. They kind of grew bigger. And like some of us grew fatter and happier through the generations to the point where they could no longer fly. Now, in the museums, they have these well-preserved skulls with the great beaks and such, and they surmised that the eggs were pretty big, and they made nests, and they only one egg at a time. Now, they found more and more fossil remains to verify some of the speculation. And this is one taxidermied version, which is perhaps most accurate. There's a famous model at Oxford, which still had enough flesh that they could study it and get better imaginings of what the plumage was. There was one that was called the white dodo on the Isle of Réunion, which again was seen and drawn, but nobody's ever found one. And so the dodo ended up as a, let's say, a once upon a time real but ever more mythical character. Even the name is not really known where it came from. They think maybe it was the sound that it would make, though there's no recordings. Some of the descriptions said they would squawk more than talk. And it may have been the name came from Dutch, because if there's a word dudar, which means a fat one or a dumb one. So these were never had a good reputation for being quick on the draw or to get away. But the name has gone down into our culture saying, well, if you're that slow and that lazy, you must be a dodo. I don't know if you know the French saying, metro boulot dodo, where you take the commute to go to work and you become a zombie or a dodo. Anyway, you can have your own version of it. But most famously, Alice in Wonderland got to carouse with the dodo bird and her adventures. And in this illustration of it, the dodo is said to say in the book, "What are we going to do now?" Which is the motto of all of us dodos. Well, it became the emblem of Mauritius in particular. And so it's on the coinage, the rupee. And nowadays they've found some pretty well preserved remains in a bog in southern Mauritius where they had enough soft tissue that was not decayed. So now they are trying to de-extinct the bird, and so somewhere they may release them and they'll be everywhere. But it's like recreating the woolly mammoth or some of our ancestors. It's an idea that may not be worth the trouble or may never happen. Well, anyway, Mauritius is one of the, I would call, the constellation of islands left over from the great colonial imperialism. So, as you know, we're down here near Réunion. We talked about Mayotte and the other French possessions, and then all the ones in the Caribbean, Polynesia, and all this. And it's a blessing of our time that we are not fighting over these things. It's the imperial competition is only who has the best hotels and the cheapest airfare, and can take the invasion of the tourism. So we're lucky that way. But it's one by one they become either independent or Réunion is proudly French, as we'll see tomorrow. Where we are in Mauritius, it is still a matter of argument between the different people that are in Mauritius that are proudly independent, but their heritage is elsewhere sometimes. There were Arabic, as I said, and maybe Maldivian, other visitors who left some notes describing these islands far away, but it's not sure where they were. They were first charted by the Portuguese explorer Mascarenhas, and he was on a cross ocean to India. He didn't follow the African coast like most of Vasco da Gama and the others did. And I put up the leader of that whole Portuguese exploration and setting up trading colonies all the way to Nagasaki, Japan, was led by Alfonso de Albuquerque. And as a matter of curiosity, I was born outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico. And Albuquerque was named after the great Portuguese explorer for some reason, but it's the only American city that has an Arabic name, because Albuquerque in Arabic means the place where the cork trees grow up in northern Portugal. So there you go, a little trivia for your next historical game. But meanwhile, as the world got discovered by the Europeans, of course there are always people where they went mostly, and they went around, it was Diaz who went around Cape Hope in 1494. Vasco da Gama came up 1496 to India, and they did find and chart, this is a Contino map of 1509, these islands. This is the Chagos and then the Maldives, Lacadives. And so it was known, and even though there were no humans on the islands, and then the sailors would stop by to pick up provisions. They had water, they had big turtles, they had plenty of birds to whack and fish to catch and such. So this was kind of the brutality of the time, that the sailors would come in and grab what they could and then leave. The first settlements were made by the Dutch and the overseas trading company in 1598, and so the earliest harbor and charts are actually Dutch, and actually the name Mauritius is named after the Prince Maurice of Orange, and so it has the island has a Dutch name origin. This was the first chart of the port of ground port on the south side of the island. And then the settlers came, and they started to ravage the wildlife and cut down the trees, mainly for repairing ships. And so that began the exploitation of this island to the point where the dodo here went extinct, the turtles went extinct. There's some out on the outer islands still, but and the industry took over with the agriculture and fishing and such. And then the French came, and as in Réunion, Mahe de la Bourdonnais set up the French administration for Mauritius, and then it became a crown of the colony of the King of France until the Revolution. And they called it, and still do sometimes, the Ile-de-France. So all the names are mostly French. And that's our Port Louis, where we're going in. And most of the population were imported, either slaves or indentured plantation workers over the time, with a French aristocracy or landed gentry that ran the plantations. And then when the British came in, they kept that property rights and business, and most people still spoke French. But the islands was run as Réunion by the French Overseas Indian Company, with this emblem I showed yesterday with the fleur-de-lis of the natives, and then King Neptune getting a sunburn. I think he's up on the pool deck right now. And then the Royal Navy came in, and Lloyd Camp gave a good presentation about the Napoleonic struggle all over the world to control the trade routes in the Indian Ocean particularly, which led to the battles for Mauritius. So like Réunion, they landed Marines and took over the island in 1810. When they attacked into Mauritius at the same time, they were repelled at sea, but they came back on another point with Marines and then conquered the island in 1810. Then in 1814, there was a treaty that gave Réunion back to the French in exchange for the British keeping Mauritius. So here's a period illustration of how the Royal Marines marched through the whole island, subduing the French resistance, and then made the agreement that set up the British rule over the French population. This was the battle at Grand Port, they call on the southeast side of the island. And again, Lloyd described how the British came in through the Narrows and tried to get behind and break up the French line, and ran aground or were bombarded and had a complete loss of 3 of their ships and 273 men. So that was memorialized in paintings, and it was the only complete French victory over the Royal Navy through that whole long period, as Lloyd was talking about, and still memorialized here as one of the victories of the time, however, lost in literature and history right now. But there is this memorial right on the shore where the battle was, with the later erection of this obelisk, which does detail to the honor and glory of both the French and the British who died in this famous battle. Meanwhile, the plantation economy went on. The people were not either removed or really repressed, and so the British administration continued what was the life of the island. So these are some illustrations back when there were traders from India, from Indonesia, from China even, who would come here for the trade, and so it was a busy place. And there's some remnants of the old town where we can go right off the dock. This was a public garden that was originally the governor's garden, which is open to the public, and there are a number of the classical buildings with time. That's Queen Victoria, I believe, right there. And some of the clubs and other sort of stately colonial architecture. This is one of the old theaters downtown. Otherwise, the city is modern all around it. This was a former home that's now turned into the historical museum for Mauritius, called the Blue Penny Museum. Again, walking distance off the dock. The island, though, was really run by the French planters, who they were always called les Ilois, the islanders. And so here's a curious picture of a hunting expedition. They all look like they're dressed for foggy day in Normandy, but look at all the deer they caught. These were introduced for hunting alone. So up in the mountains in the forest, they brought them in and then they would have their sport with it. But you can imagine it was a very languid lifestyle here. Maybe you were prosperous and you had all these workers or slaves for quite a while. That would make the colonial life as it was back then. And there was a famous novel in French in 1783 called Paul and Virginie, which was the coming-of-age story of teenagers in the island plantation community who found their way, and this was a very popular book in France at the time. But the writer was from Mauritius, and he detailed the life here. That's him. Bernardin Saint-Pierre is his name. And so the French culture is mostly audible. You can hear the Creole here, which is mostly French. The flag of the port of Louis has fleur-de-lis on it, and the crest of the town also has fleur-de-lis on it, and but there's the cooperation, which has meant it's fairly peaceful here over the time. There have always been either slave rebellions, pirates coming by, or internal arguments in the government, which go on to this day. But over the top of that was either the French Empire or the British Empire, and this was the flag of the British East India Company, which flew over here for quite a while till they needed more protection, and it became a crown colony with an appointed governor. And this is one of the last ones back when the Seychelles and Mauritius were under a governor here. Now they both become independent countries, and for the while they were under the British overseas Indian Ocean overseas territories, and this was their flag. So the stripes got rather wavy. And then they had an emblem for this particular British territory, which had two honorary turtles as citizens, and of course the Queen. And still Mauritius is part of the Commonwealth and has cooperative relations in general, but in the decolonialization in the 1960s, Mauritius became its own independent nation, 1968, and took this flag, which you'll see everywhere, and this emblem, which returned the dodo bird to its prominence, and sugarcane is the basis of the economy. And the Latin motto means Stella clavisque maris indici, which means the stars are the key to crossing the ocean, or to indicate where to go as a navigator. Well, when the independence came, it was peaceful with the first Prime Minister, Ramgoolam, he was of Tamil Indian heritage, and actually his son or grandson is now the Prime Minister. And so this is a small country with a small parliamentary government and peaceful relations, even though there's always labor disputes or international disputes to stir up the populace a bit. So there's been a series of, let's say, contested elections and judicial protests. So it's just like everywhere else that way. That's the trouble with democracy. But here we're going to come into Port Louis, which is a pretty big deep water port and the extensive city. And we'll be docking probably right over here. But you can see how rugged the interior is already, though not quite as rugged as Réunion. And so the city is grown, and there's the small historic district and those buildings I showed you, but mostly it's a pretty modern place. And we'll have them overnight there, so we can go out and enjoy the evening cool and go see some of the different neighborhoods, if you wish, after our tours. And up over the main port, there's the old racetrack, or the Champ de Mars in French, and that's still there. And they have horse races, so we can go maybe borrow a horse and join the race. And then the cuisine in the town, though, is mostly Indian style. Some Indonesian, a lot of spices and fresh fruit and such. So that if you haven't had enough to eat on the ship, there's more ashore. But the issue of these days is the Chagos Archipelago, which again is 800 more sea miles to the north of Mauritius. And this was cited again by the Portuguese, and they call it Chagos, which means pain, as in wounded pain. I think because there were shipwrecks all around here. These little coral atolls are very shallow, and you can't see them until you run into them, usually, if you're on a sail ship. And these are hundreds of little ones all through this area, but there's only firm land on a couple of them, Diego Garcia and up on the Bezos up there. But they're only little spits of ground above the lapping sea on a coral base. These are not volcanic, so there's nothing high on them. But they were settled as, again, plantations for the copra trade and the coconuts. And so thousands of workers were brought in from Africa and Indonesia and India to work on these bits of land to make copra and coconut oil, things you make out of that. The problem was that shortly, in a couple of hundred years, there were so many other production areas. These islands were not worth the trouble. They didn't have enough land or workers to make it happen. Now it's all gone wild again because it's been made a separate reserve. And in the independence of 1968, the British government took the Chagos Archipelago and said, well, that's not part of the new country of Mauritius, it'll be the British territory, which at the time was not considered so much of a problem. And then subsequently, they've tried to make it one of the largest marine reserves in the world just because of the pristine nature of most of the reefs. Now, this is where it gets a little complicated. They have this beautiful area up there, but there's no population. The original plantation workers of the Chagos were all removed, about 1,000 or more, to make for the military base, which dominates the island group now. Meanwhile, around it, it is protected marine area. They don't allow any international fishing to happen within the economic zone, and so it's considered one of the best preserved and pristine marine reserves in the Indian Ocean. And so you can go, if you were allowed there, you could go see all this coral and fish life there, but we can see it off many other places too. But when it was declared a marine reserve, the country of Mauritius appealed to the United Nations to stop that and to cancel the British Overseas Territory status and give the Chagos Archipelago back or to Mauritius. And that's still in debate. In October, the British government and Mauritius made a tentative agreement to allow the return of the archipelago with a lease back of the military base. Meanwhile, it's mostly birds and wildlife, including this coconut crab, which is the biggest land crab in the world, even bigger than those big red crabs in Australia. But these live in the coconut trees, and they can climb up and grab a coconut and break it. They're that strong. So they're not exactly pet-worthy, I'd say. But meanwhile, the real issue is this. This is the island of Diego Garcia, which is named after Portuguese discoverers of this group in this island. But that's one of the major Air Force bases for the US and UK in the Indian Ocean. And so a lot of it has been, let's say, cleared to make a runway. There was a plantation down here. And the roads are made out of excavated coral. But you can notice here the name of this facility, the Footprint of Freedom. Well, that's a nice euphemism, as if all you need is a little room for your your toys, which include B-52 bombers and B-2 bombers. And that's the strategic essence of this dispute. And the UK and the US maintain this base, so they have a central position in the Indian Ocean. And of course, others don't agree. The government of India doesn't like it that much, and of course China doesn't like it that much because they're building their own facilities around the Indian Ocean. So this is considered a strategic key to the status quo, if you want to call it that. And I was once recruited to move there and run a U.S. Navy ships to go to the Persian Gulf. And it was considered safe harbor to come and get repair and or supplies in Diego Garcia and then go to the then disputed waters of the Persian Gulf. Meanwhile, the Chagosian, they call them the 1,000 or more people who were removed in the late 1960s and 70s, left some houses. The plantations are now untended, but they want to come back, and again they file suit with one of the International Maritime Court and a few others to try to get right of return, and to which the UK government took a position that these people who were workers here were actually not indigenous. They came from either Africa or India or Indonesia, so that they don't have status as aboriginals nor indigenous culture. So that's a good debate over a drink somewhere. But meanwhile, the remains of their settlements are gone to ruin, like this church. And so I don't know whether they'll ever go back. Now they're living in Mauritius and also in the Seychelles. And the British government already paid £4 million in compensation to the 1,000 or so people back when they were removed. But again, these disputes are sort of a tempest in a teapot, but for the people there, it's very much a serious issue. But meanwhile, Mauritius is a beautiful place, many islands, and people come here for holiday. And so for whatever disputes of the past or present, it's still a great place to visit. And I wish you a great trip there, and see you ashore. Thank you very much.